Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so let's dive into something that honestly still blows my mind a bit. It's 1985, the Cold War. Decades, right? Decades of this nuclear standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The whole world's on edge.
Yeah, talk about a high-stakes game of chess where every move could be the last one.
Exactly. And then, into this whole mess steps, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes leader of the Soviet Union. What a time to take charge, right? The Soviet system was, to put it mildly, not doing so hot.
It was a system really feeling the pressure. You had a stagnant economy, whispers of political unrest getting louder and louder. Something had to give.
So you'd think, okay, new guy in charge, time to tighten the grip, double down on control.
Well, that was the playbook, absolutely.
Not Gorbachev. He flips the script with Perestroika and Glasnost. These were huge, unexpected moves.
Perestroika was about trying to inject some life into that struggling Soviet economy.
Yeah.
Basically, Gorbachev's thinking was, let's allow some, and this is a really loose term here, free market principles into the mix.
It was like mixing oil and water, from what I understand. A colossal gamble.
Totally. And then there was Glasnost, which was like, hey, let's have some open discussion. Imagine that in the Soviet Union, encouraging people to criticize the government, to speak their minds.
The first material really gets into how this was basically unthinkable before Gorbachev.
It was a total 180. And historian John Lewis Gaddis, whose work we're looking at here, makes a really interesting point. He argued that these reforms, well, maybe well-intentioned, they just weren't compatible with how the Soviet system was built. Like, trying to patch a wooden boat with steel might work for a minute, but...
Yeah, not a long-term solution. And it's important to remember, all of this is happening against the backdrop of a global arms race that was just sucking the life out of both the U.S. and Soviet economies.
It was unsustainable.
Yeah.
And Gorbachev, dealing with a struggling economy at home, and then Reagan over in the U.S. with his Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program, it was a wake-up call.
Okay, so zoom in with me for a second. 1985, Geneva. That first meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan.
Yeah.
Totally. And it wasn't about signing treaties or anything, not yet. It was about those two guys in a room, sizing each other up, trying to find some common ground. A real thawing of the Cold War ice.
Right. And then you have Reykjavik in '86. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because what Gorbachev put on the table was mind-blowing. He was willing to talk about eliminating a whole category of nuclear weapons, those intermediate-range missiles. Nobody saw that coming.
Such a bold move, and it paves the way for that incredible moment in '87, the Washington Summit. That's where the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, is signed. The first time the superpowers agreed to get rid of an entire class of nukes.
Our source even quotes historian David Reynolds here, who said it best. The Cold War ended not with a bang or a whimper, but a handshake.
And that handshake, it was solidified a year later in Moscow. A new era, at least, that was the hope.
But it also sparked a debate that's still going on among historians. There's the Orthodox view, which gives Reagan most of the credit for ending the Cold War. This idea that his tough stance, his military buildup, that's what forced Gorbachev's hand.
And then there's the revisionist view, which says, hold on, Gorbachev was playing 3D chess this whole time. He wasn't just reacting to Reagan, he was actively looking to change the entire game.
It's fascinating to consider both sides.
Absolutely. And one thing that's clear is that Gorbachev's influence wasn't limited to those summits with Reagan. He was making waves globally in a way no Soviet leader ever had. We've been focusing on the nuclear side of things, but the Cold War was also a series of proxy wars fought all over the globe, and one of the most brutal, definitely one that left a mark, was the Soviet-Afghan War.
Yeah, that war was a huge drain on the Soviet Union, both in terms of resources and, the human cost. It had been dragging on for years.
And then Gorbachev makes this move that nobody expected. He pulls the plug, orders the withdrawal of Soviet troops.
1989, they finally pull out completely.
And it's a huge deal for a bunch of reasons, right? It's not just about cutting their losses in a war that seemed unwinnable. It also signals this major shift away from the Brezhnev Doctrine.
That whole idea, basically, that the Soviet Union was obligated to prop up communist regimes wherever they were threatened, no matter what. Gorbachev was like, nope, not playing that game anymore.
Yeah, it was like he was drawing a line. And it wasn't just Afghanistan. He starts scaling back Soviet support for communist movements in other parts of the world, too.
Big changes in Soviet foreign policy, that's for sure.
So was this just a pragmatic move? Like, hey, we can't afford these commitments anymore? Or was it something deeper? Like, Gorbachev was really rethinking the Soviet Union's place in the world.
It's interesting, right? Because both interpretations make sense. Our source actually quotes Gorbachev's own foreign minister, Edward Shevardnadze, at the Malta summit in 1989. He said, and I love this quote, "The superpowers have buried the Cold War at the bottom of the Mediterranean."
Wow. Powerful imagery. You could really feel things shifting globally. But nowhere was that more obvious than in Eastern Europe. 1989, the year the Iron Curtain starts to crumble for real.
It was like watching a dam break. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, people were taking to the streets demanding change, demanding freedom from Soviet control. And here's the thing, Gorbachev, he doesn't send in the tanks.
I mean, that's the thing that blows my mind every time I think about it. Just a few decades earlier, you have Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68. The Soviets didn't hesitate to use force back then. Brutal crackdowns.
Totally different story this time. And historian Archie Brown, who we're reading here, he argues that this was the key. Gorbachev's decision not to intervene militarily, it allowed for this relatively peaceful transition to democracy in Eastern Europe.
A peaceful end to decades of Soviet domination. It was truly unprecedented.
Right. And it makes you wonder, did Gorbachev, by refusing to prop up those crumbling communist regimes, did he actually hasten the collapse of the Soviet Union itself?
Now, that is a question. Was he, without realizing it, sawing off the branch he was sitting on? It's easy to look back and see it as a sign of weakness, maybe. But what if it took even more strength, more conviction, to defy decades of Soviet thinking and choose a path of peace? I mean, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around it, right?
Right.
You've got Gorbachev, leader of a superpower, and he makes this series of choices that completely go against the grain.
Right.
Internal reforms, even though it could shake the Soviet system to its core, dialogue and negotiation over military might, and then letting go of control in Eastern Europe, just accepting that wave of change instead of trying to crush it.
And those decisions, those are what make Gorbachev such a puzzle, in a good way. I mean, talk about pressure. He was dealing with huge stakes, a world on edge, and he still dared to imagine something different.
And you can't ignore the fact that those reforms, as bold as they were, they ultimately played a role in the Soviet Union's collapse just a few years later, right?
Yeah, our source material definitely makes that connection.
Perestroika and Glasnost, they unleashed forces that were really tough to control in a system that had been so rigid for so long. It's like they opened the floodgates and...
It's true. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a chaotic time, no doubt about it. Economic hardship, political turmoil, a lot of people went through some really tough times.
It shows you that even when you're trying to do the right thing, there can be unintended consequences, right?
Definitely.
But it also shows you that history is messy. It doesn't always follow a straight line. And Gorbachev, he's a perfect example of that. Celebrated for helping end the Cold War peacefully, but also criticized for the instability that followed the Soviet collapse. It's complicated.
Totally. I mean, can you imagine another leader at that time making the choices he did? Reagan, for example, with his hardline approach. Could he have navigated those years with the same commitment to peace?
That's the question, isn't it? Or someone steeped in the old Soviet ways, would they have even thought about those kind of radical reforms, let alone actually done them?
Right. It makes you think.
What if he had clung to those old ways, put control above everything else? Would the Cold War have dragged on? Maybe even escalated into something even more dangerous?
Chilling to think about.
Would we be talking about tanks rolling into Eastern Europe instead of, cautious acceptance?
These are the what-ifs that historians will debate forever. There's no way to know for sure. But what we can say is that Gorbachev's actions, they changed the course of history. No doubt about it.
It really makes you think, right? Sometimes it's the leaders who are willing to go against the grain, to choose a different path, who really end up shaping the destiny of nations of the world.
Absolutely. It's a powerful legacy, one that still sparks debate and makes us think about the choices leaders make when faced with huge challenges.
Couldn't have said it better myself. A huge thanks to you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev. Definitely a figure who defied expectations and, by doing so, helped bring an end to one of the most dangerous chapters in human history.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.